what's up, Tolkien Poppers? You got Nick here with the first official Tolkien Pop podcast episode. Well, kind of. I was working on some official audio content for you guys, and this was going to be our first episode. And I had an awesome talk lined up with Dr. Robin Ann Reid, who is a Tolkien scholar, a literary scholar, and has just done some awesome, fantastic stuff for the Tolkien community, both fandom and academic. She's an independent scholar, and she is actually the series editor for the Studies in Tolkien for McFarlane, which is a cool academic publishing company that makes some really affordable books that aren't $1 million. So you should definitely check out McFarlane. And she actually has a book coming out called Queer Approaches to Tolkien, which is going to be a collection of essays, which I'll have a link to in the show notes that you should absolutely check out. She also has a Substack called Writing from Athelion. Yeah, Athelion, the one where Sam and Frodo check out on their way to Mordor with all the cool herbs and stuff. Yeah, she's writing in there. It's beautiful, and she has some really awesome stuff. But, unfortunately, because I am a noob and podcasting is hard, the audio that I had for the interview is completely unusable and gone. So I am thankful because Trip Fuller from Homebrewed Christianity is allowing me to share an interview that Robin and I did a couple years back for the online summit that Trip and I did called Interchanging Melodies, where we had a bunch of Tolkien scholars come and talk about different aspects of philosophy and theology surrounding Tolkien. And Robin did an interview about a project that she's still working on called Atheist and Agnostics fandom around Tolkien. It's not called that, but it is a project that kind of collects those experiences. So this is what we talk about there, and it's a great conversation. Robin's hilarious, and we had a lot of fun on this interview, and hopefully in the future we'll actually have a fresh interview where the audio is good so you can see and hear, because there is video content, video stuff too. Some of the projects that she's working on, which has to do with queer theory, as we talked about the new book, feminist approaches, and other cool liberative stuff. So anyway, hope you enjoy this interview with Robin, and look forward to future Tolkien Pop podcast stuff. So that'll be available here on the Substack too, but if you go to Apple Podcast and Stitcher and Overcast, wherever, YouTube, all the podcast audio will be there. So if you rate and review that stuff, you kind of bring it out to the masses, that'd be cool. So anyway, enjoy this interview with Robin, and I will talk to you guys soon. What's up, Tolkien heads? Today we have a real treat. We are joined today by Dr. Robin Ann Reid, who, if you didn't know, is just a badass Tolkien scholar, literary scholar, feminist scholar, all the scholarship, all the things. If you know it, she's probably done it. But Robin, she's retired as a professor of the Department of Literature and Languages at Texas A&M University Commerce in May 2020. Hooray, retirement. She declined to apply for emerita status because of her deep disdain of the corporate exploitation of faculty, staff, and students that characterizes the current system of higher education. She's enjoying retirement as an independent scholar while serving as the area chair for the Tolkien Studies area of the Popular Culture Association in writing. Her current projects in progress include a reception study of atheist, agnostic, and animist readers of Tolkien's Legendarium, an anthology co-edited with Christopher Ficarro and Stephen Yundell, who we've had on Tolkien Heads, by the way, titled We Could Do With a Bit More Queerness in These Parts, Tolkien's Queer Legendarium, and then a second anthology, Race, Racism, and Racist, Essays on J.R. Tolkien's Legendarium, Adaptations, and Readers, under contract at McFarlane, and an essay about her love and cornerstones for Joanna Russ and J.R.R. Tolkien. So, lengthy and awesome. It does not cover how awesome you are, Robin. Thanks for doing this, and welcome to, I guess, our little Tolkien Heads interview. I'm excited to have you.
Oh, thank you. I'm excited to be here.
So you're on the West Coast. We were kind of chit-chatting before I hit record. How are you doing with the extreme back and forth weather patterns?
Well, we're having more extreme than I would have expected. I actually went to Bellingham in the 80s. I was here for university, and that's one reason we retired here is I love it so much. And at that point, it wasn't that extreme. Of course, climate change is everywhere. And it's still not as extreme as what can happen in Texas, where I taught for 27 years, where you could have anywhere from 110 degrees to 10 degrees over the course of a year. People don't think of snow in Texas, but Northeast Texas can get snow and ice, and not to mention tornadoes. So.
Yeah, I'm glad that you are in a place where the extremes are not as extreme as Texas. So glad you are surviving and that you're here with us. So I think I'm just going to jump right in here, Robin, because I know a lot of people. I've talked to you for, I guess I've known you for maybe like a year or so from the pandemic, something like that, as you put together the Researching Tolkien group. And so we've kind of sent each other messages and connected each other with people. And so I've talked about you to Trip. And so we finally snagged you. And so people will be able to just be enlightened by your scholarship and all the other projects you do. But tell us a little bit how you came to Tolkien and how you started your intellectual journey with him.
Okay, well, actually, I first read Tolkien's when I was 8. A librarian told me I would like it because it was like Oz stories, which I loved. I did not like it. It is not like Oz. And of course, it was advertised that way, I'm sure. But a couple of years later, a friend of my mother's thought I might enjoy Lord of the Rings, and I did. So at age 10, I fell totally in love with Lord of the Rings, read it constantly, nagged everybody I knew to read it. In fact, I was at a high school reunion and people were looking at me saying, I read Lord of the Rings because of you, and I like the movies. I'm going, yes, my work is done here. So like many of my things, I actually started with a great love for the work. I was a science fiction fantasy fan from an early age. I loved science fiction and fantasy. And I actually did not do what many people do when they love Tolkien, which is go into medieval studies. I describe it as I came out of reading Tolkien as a nature poet and an animist. So creative writing and, a lot of nature poetry, which, given that it was the 70s and everybody else was writing sex, drugs, rock and roll poetry, really made me stand out in my creative writing program. So I eventually, when I became a feminist, which I did a little in my later 20s, I quit reading Tolkien because I was afraid I would hate it like I disliked some of the other male science fiction fantasy writers that I had liked before I became a feminist. But I never got rid of my books. So I held on to them. It says in a mystic way. I actually specialized when I got to my doctorate in critical theory and marginalized literatures, and ended up working with feminist science fiction and fantasy, or feminist speculative fiction, which is what I did for 10 years, my first 10 years at Texas A&M Commerce. And I and everybody else was shocked when I suddenly fell in love with Peter Jackson's Fellowship of the Rings, started watching it constantly, told everybody about it, dragged all my friends to it, and started writing Tolkien scholarship and teaching Tolkien with a colleague of mine. We got grants to do summer institutes on Tolkien for teachers. We collaborated on papers, and all my feminist SF fans are going, what? So that's what I have to explain and figure out sometime, that the two most important writers for my entire life were J.R.R. Tolkien and Joanna Russ. And given the stereotype that is actually inaccurate, because it's a stereotype that feminists don't like Tolkien, it's like, actually Joanna Russ apparently liked Tolkien enough to do a play based on The Hobbit. So Doug Anderson
Really?
had found it and told me about it. So I fell in love with the film, and actually, although I've written on the films and on the Legendarium as a text, and also on fandom reception of it, I think I got started in terms of feeling frustrated because so many academics at the conferences I was attending so hated Peter Jackson's films. And since I loved them, this reminded me of when I was an English major in the 70s, when I loved science fiction and fantasy, and all my English profs, except my Shakespeare teacher, thought it was trash. So it's like, oh, I have to prove you wrong. So let me write some stuff. And that's how I got started writing on Tolkien. And actually, besides writing on it for an academic audience, the films yanked me. I ended up back in fandom. I'd been in science fiction fantasy fandom in the 70s and 80s. I'd left it when I was writing my dissertation, because writing a dissertation takes time. But when I got back into the films, I went online. Friends recruited me for LiveJournal, and I ended up writing fan fiction. So it's all Peter Jackson's fault. Dragged me into
Damn that Peter Jackson.
and it's been wonderful. So
No, that's so, I love, I've known a little bit of your story, but I think a lot of people who attend this conference, I really love that you kind of talked about Peter Jackson kind of hooking you back in after, you had kind of stayed away. Because I know my own experience, I was in, I had just started my secondary education when the film started coming out, the Peter Jackson films, and that's how I came to Tolkien myself, and now participating in Tolkien scholarship and things like that. And I know a lot of people are kind of coming back to Tolkien or for the first time with the Rings of Power. And I think too, because we've done stuff with homebrewed Christianity, that there's just a lot of connections where we've got people who grew up in church or some sort of religious institution. They were like, they went to college or they lived life differently, explored, and they were like, this whole church thing, religion thing isn't for me. And then they come back, maybe something ties them in, and they're like, okay, I'm still a huge nerd about this stuff. Mm-hmm. And how do I wrestle with these questions as, we have atheist Christians who are like, I still find these things meaningful. How do I participate in this community when maybe 75% of the people, if I explicitly told them my beliefs or whatever, they may not want me around. So I think that your experience is really helpful for helping people not only in fandom spaces, and I love that, you brought in fan fiction too, which I feel like a lot of people, and you can tell me, confirm if I'm right or wrong, but I feel like fan fiction people feel on the outskirts of fandom, like they're like alone and the weirdos. But there's so many people who write fan fiction and read it, and who even wrestle with some of these questions before scholars have, or people who are kind of in mainstream fandom. So, yeah, thank you for that. I guess just, I don't know, do you have anything in response to what I said?
Other than what's fascinating, and I found this when I was teaching and we had our institutes, and that people's origin, I call it the origin story, people's origin stories, how they first found Tolkien, or, they came to Tolkien after the films, or what other sort of routes they read, took them there, are endlessly fascinating, endlessly varied. And it's almost always surprising because, I would have pagans in class and I would have Christians, and they were always surprised that the other group existed, because, we do tend to sort of live in our bubbles and stuff. Although obviously rural Texas, the Christians were the majority, but there are pagans in rural Texas. So, and even some atheists, but, yes, it's interesting. It's fascinating. I wish that we could do more to get people's stories of sort of why they read Tolkien, what they find in Tolkien, because there's disagreements in fandom. There's disagreements among academics. I mean, in terms of how it is that it became so popular in the 60s and it maintained popularity. And then, of course, the adaptations. Fan fiction is fascinating, and actually, if people are interested in learning about Tolkien fandom, I would highly recommend and encourage you sometime, if you haven't already done it, talking to Don Walls Thuma or Don Felligan, who is the head of the Silmarillion Writers Guild, who is one of the few people who's done major survey statistical analysis more than once on Tolkien fandoms, on Tolkien fandom, trying to get as wide a possible spread, even though, not just the Silmarillion, because she's found some fascinating stuff, including the fact that the Peter Jackson films brought more people in to read The Lord of the Rings. And her findings by actually getting this information from fans completely contradicts a number of my friends who are literary profs, who are just convinced that Peter Jackson's films would destroy everything, that nobody would ever read Tolkien again because they could go watch the films. And it was like, aha, little did you realize. Don also thinks that that's going to happen with, Rings of Power, that there's something about Tolkien adaptations that she's found that seems to really draw people. Not everybody. I knew people in live journal fandom who tried reading Tolkien and didn't like his work. They just loved the films, and that's perfectly valid. But a lot of people do find their way into the books after the films.
Yeah, I can second Dawn's scholarship. I've engaged with it. Her stuff is fascinating. Like you said, it points to some of these narratives that are wrong, that even now people in the Rings of Power stuff who are like, you're disrespecting Tolkien, his books are ruined. And it's like, okay, if we have this stuff, history is probably going to repeat itself, and more people are probably going to come into Tolkien, which, as Tolkien evangelists, that's what it's all about, And so, really helpful, I think. So people have some areas that they can go into from that. I think you and I both have pretty positive views about adaptation, even if we don't necessarily like what the adaptations have done. We let people enjoy things. So, I get
pretty carried away once in a while. I will sometimes say that, whether it's a fan fiction transformative works or an official adaptation that's authorized for commercial purposes, or an academic essay, they're all just interpretations and ways of reading Tolkien. If we think of an academic essay somehow more prestigious than fan fiction, that's just a reflection of the hierarchies that surround us that, of course, should be totally overthrown. And in fact, I'm not the only Tolkien academic who also writes fan fiction and can move between sort of both of those spaces.
Yeah, I think people, and this will help us transition to the next part, but I think when people start thinking about their fandom, or even about religion or philosophy or the nature of things, people who I want to say maybe more honest or more open to maybe not having all the answers or being siloed, that we realize a lot of people come to realize that experience, fandoms, culture, the world is just an amalgam of just, I don't know, what is it? It's a tapestry of craziness, and it can be beautiful and chaotic. And we look at it and sometimes try to, like you said, interpret it. So I guess, and it's not any different, I think, for just since Tolkien fandom began as he wrote his works and it was popular, and then of course scholarship that came after that. And so after around probably 50 or so years of Tolkien scholarship, why do you think it's taken this long for work on atheist, agnostic, and animist perspectives to arise in the field? Just because they've been out there. You're an atheist or an animist, agnostic, I think, right? Atheist? I don't know.
When I was a kid, I was lukewarm Presbyterian because my family went to church. Yeah. Although my main interest was I had such a crush on the choir teacher, who was looked just like Julie Andrews. And we stopped going to church. Lots of long stories, actually varying reasons. And I sort of just drifted along until I was dropping out of college, and there was some bad times, and I had a goddess vision on a beach one day. So I became a sort of poetry writing Wiccan goddess, solitary. I never joined any of the groups or covens or whatever, because that just wasn't my thing. And actually, if I'd stayed on the West Coast, I probably would have just sort of stayed in there because it was very comfortable. It was only when I moved to rural Texas, and people, all of my friends are like, "Why are you going to Texas?" I have a job, a tenure track job offer. This is not something you turn down unless you know it's really so horrible, you know, you can't stand it. And I thought this was a joke. I was warned by people I knew on the committee who, you know, when I was there and then I came to move in, and they said the first thing anybody will ask you when you come here is what church you go to. And they did. And this was a small town in rural Texas, like 8,000 people. There were 45 churches,
Wow.
all some type of Christian on the in the phone book. Now, some of them met in garages and bakeries after hours, but they all were listed, and it was also for someone coming from the Northwest, not knowing very much about how the many American churches denominations split, including the Presbyterian, because of the Civil War. The southern branches supported slavery,
Right.
the northern branches didn't. So I had never been around that sort of Southern evangelicalism, fundamentalism, factionalism. I mean, so after I'd been there a while, it was like sort of me sitting there going, damn, I'm an atheist because I don't believe any of this.
Yeah.
And, you know, my poetry and I mean, animism is like, could be eco-criticism, could be environmentalism, but yeah. So it was being in that context. And I would tell people I came out as queer on my university and department, and I advised the student group and did all sorts of things. I came out as queer a long time before I came out as atheist in that context. So yeah, that's sort of my background.
Okay. So I guess too, you know, I think that will be helpful too, because we have a lot of queer folks who are involved in homebrewed Christianity, because it is one of the few theological spaces that they can go to and be not just be, you know, quote unquote welcomed, like some of these evangelical churches say, you're welcome.
Tolerated.
But exactly. It's one of the few places that they can feel at home, accepted, and even thrive, hopefully. And so just for people who are looking to Robin has done some scholarship on queer readings of Tolkien, obviously still engaging in that. So if you're interested in that, definitely check that stuff out. You know, and similarly, because I'm from Tennessee, I grew up in Florida, so I'm very familiar with the Southern culture, 45 churches within a half-mile radius. And even, you know, I think that one of the things that this platform and lots of people are committed to is just the diversity of ideas, and saying that whether you're atheist, you're Buddhist, or some sort of Christian, what even those things even mean, you know, whatever those things mean, that if we talk to each other and listen to each other and learn about each other, the world becomes a richer place. We learn more, we become better people, etc. And so I think similarly for scholarship, like instead of all these people who are approaching Tolkien theologically as Catholics or evangelicals or classical theists, or saying you have to have every political theological view that Tolkien had in order to understand him or do scholarship well, like why do you think that trajectory may be not the best or accurate?
Well, I mean, it becomes complicated because, I mean, one of the things that I quote in my queer scholarship is an insight by Alexander Doty, who makes the very good point that queer is not automatically progressive. I mean, we have queer Trump supporters. So I think atheist is not automatically progressive, because I read a lot of atheist blogs. I was like lurking on atheist blogs during some of the big debates about new atheism and feminism and all that stuff. So they're atheists who are very much conservative, anti-immigrant, Islamophobic, misogynistic, all of the above. And nor is it true that all churches or Christians are somehow conservative. They're very complex mosaics. And so I came out of it with my motto is, I'd rather align myself, coalition work, hang out with, talk to progressives who are Christians or from any belief system, rather than atheists, well, who are assholes and obnoxious about their conservatism. In terms of, I think we're actually getting closer to 70 years of Tolkien scholarship, depending on
Okay.
how you define the scholarship. I mean, the first academic scholarship on Tolkien was in the 50s, and it was on his Beowulf essay. And a lot of the medievalists really loved that. I mean, he established Beowulf studies as a discipline,
Yeah.
subfield in English with that essay, which he probably didn't mean to do, because the lit lang debate was complex for him. But certainly by the 60s, there was academic scholarship happening. I think it's just starting to shift, and it's really not very much. When I went looking for some of the atheist stuff, I could not find any doing keyword searches or subject searches in the subscription databases. I could find some atheists writing about Tolkien online, and those are interesting. I found the one peer-reviewed essay, as far as I know, in Paul Carey's book on sort of Christian readings of Tolkien. It's an essay about the spiritual values of the Entwives, and you wouldn't know it was an atheist piece unless you read it, because the author comes out as atheist in the first paragraph. And I'm interested in how that ended up in that particular book. I don't know if you know it. I think it's The Ring and the Cross.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So in fact, I corresponded a little bit with the author. I did not, and what got me started, and I put the quotes in the handout that you can share, is of course Verlin Flieger's fantastic, but what did he really mean? And The Arch and the Keystone, which talks about all the contradictory things, just what we were talking about, that, and makes a pretty good argument, I think, with lots of textual support, that Tolkien's own utterances and writings contradicted himself, quote, from page to page, and sometimes in the same paragraph. And she analyzes on fairy stories and other things and shows, yeah, he could completely contradict himself. But what did he really mean essay, she talks about sort of Christians and neo-pagans. And I was going, okay, I sort of used to be, but I'm not anymore. And then I was reading a collection edited by Ralph Wood, and his final essay, in that it's a postmodern Tolkien or something, was pretty much claiming that Lord of the Rings would convert sort of hegemonic terrorist modern readers, even if they didn't know it. So it even goes beyond an allegorical reading. It is like, this text will convert you to classical Christian virtues of the hobbits. And I'm going, ha! Neener, I'm here. I've been reading it since I was 10. It never converted me. In fact, I became an atheist. So I started wondering, who cares about the atheist? But I hang out, and I found when I was reading my survey results that how people define atheist is very different from person to person.
Yeah.
And in fact, some agnostic, or some people who identify as agnostics, have a stronger statement of a lack of belief in a central God than the atheists do. So,
Wow.
there's the dictionary definition, and then there's how everybody defines. And what I did in my survey was just leave everything open-ended. I didn't give them Likert scales or check this box. It was like, if you want to answer this, fill this in and tell me what you think. So the complexity among how it's defined, and I think the fact that there's such a wide range shows the issues around atheism in the contemporary world. And of course it's mostly US, because I was in English. But actually I track research on the Pew Research Center and another public research center that sort of tracks through surveys, ask people what they believe, what they think of other people. And atheists have gotten less discriminated against or more liked over the years, and as well as being more trusted now by the data that these public sites post. And so it makes for some interesting reading. That atheism, it's still critiqued by many people, but it's not as widely critiqued. So I think that makes it a good time for people to start saying, and I'm pretty sure there have always been readers of Tolkien who are women and feminists and people of color reading Tolkien. They may not have shown up in the official fans or in the scholarship, and Tolkien academic circles are still pretty white. There's a much more complex group of readers out there, which is why one of my sort of big things that I want to push is the need for more reception studies, more, especially finding people who can do the kind of larger projects that Dawn does, and have some institutional support to do it, rather than just the traditional model of the humanities scholar sitting alone writing their interpretation, which is great to read, but it's just their interpretation. Even though an awful lot of people who write this use we and talk about readers generally, but they're not talking about any actual readers they've talked to. They're talking about their imagined view of readers. So I wanted to go out and find out what people, atheists and agnostics, and then a couple of my friends pointed out a lot of animists and neo-pagans don't believe in a sort of central God.
Yeah.
So I said, okay, let's ask them too. Let's see what these people who don't fit into this official sort of religious umbrella think of it.
Yeah.
So that's where it came from.
And you kind of hinted at it, just talking about the complexity of Tolkien, and you even talked about why it's important to recognize that. And I think that you and I would both agree that even recognizing that complexity, for me, number one, gives me a piece about myself, that there's conflicting things with my own self and people that I know that I don't have to reconcile to be a happy or holistic human being, potentially. And number two, it even maybe helps you enjoy, engage with Tolkien more. And then, of course, bringing that into where the complexity of, I guess, more of just turning on the lights where people who aren't normally recognized as readers, whether it's women, people of color, queer folks who have always been there, atheists, and just saying, okay, let's shine a light on this because it's here and the complexity is here. And that just has a benefit in and of itself, potentially. And so it reminded me, you were talking about reception studies and that push for that, and how the reception of things can also help shine a light on that and what people mean in their own individualism without interpreters falling into like hegemony or categorizing people into a singular group when they don't. And so you had sent me an article before this interview about kind of reception in Harry Potter circles, and talked about how people simultaneously think Harry Potter's Satanist, simultaneously very Christian, atheist, even all these perspectives coming together, and each one pretty much, like, I've grew up in evangelical circles where people were like, this is satanic, get away from it. And then I had friends who read it with their families who were like, Harry Potter is Jesus, And so, and you remind me of the author's name of that article that you're talking about.
Oh,
that you
I'd
sent to me?
have to pick it up. I think it's hot just.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah. I just found that when I was looking at that anthology, and it would only caught my eye because it was like Harry Potter, atheist stuff. And what struck me about that was it was so similar to issues with Tolkien and the article, the essay, it's actually a chapter, looks very much at online sources, to talk about this. So it's like, the wide response and sort of general things, not individual fans being surveyed, but how many churches were trying to ban Harry Potter, people having book burnings, other people having study groups in church to do that, and then of course and really the conclusion that author came to is pretty much the thing that Tolkien said about his work. There is no institutional religion. There is no church in it. And you can talk all you want about, subtext and the imagery and all that other stuff, but it's true. There is no place that people in Middle Earth or Harry Potter go to worship God.
Right.
And I had never thought about that before. I thought one of the reasons that people were so, because I wasn't going to read Harry Potter first, because everybody was talking about it. Oh my God, but all of a sudden I started having my students come in to see me and say, my child who never read or finished a book before has read all the Harry Potter books, but the new one isn't coming out soon. Can you recommend any fantasy that would, fill this gap and keep them reading? And I was going, ha, ha, ha. Yes, I can. Let me get you a list. So Harry Potter was very much a gateway for, the first fantasy book you read that grabs you and brings you into reading every fantasy book that you can get a hold of. So I thought I'd better take a look at it and read it. And it was very interesting, and I actually taught it a time or two. And I thought one of the reasons so many of because I had students who were teaching high school. A lot of our students at A&M Commerce went into secondary English teaching, and the stories they had to tell about how some parents hated Harry Potter and all this stuff and wanted it out were kind of terrifying. I thought one of the reasons there was so much pushback against it was because it was a boarding school, and that's a very English form because of the use of the boarding school plot in England. Right. In ways that isn't as large in America. But yeah, they were going to the wizarding school and becoming that, and it was all evil. So I thought it was reflecting the anti-public education that's such a strong strain among many evangelicals and
right.
fundamentalists. And I think it is, but that book also made me realize it was the same thing as Tolkien, because Judy and I were teaching Tolkien classes, and we would have both history and English and other majors in it. And we used to have class discussions and talk to the students. And we had students whose churches and ministers and parents would forbid reading any fantasy, but especially Harry Potter and Tolkien, and others who wouldn't let them read Harry Potter, but Tolkien was okay, or no Tolkien, but C.S. Lewis was okay. So you could go to different churches or different regions in just around us, where our student body mostly came from about 2 hours around a little town in Northeast Texas, and find completely different perspectives on these works by the churches. So that in itself is fascinating.
Yeah, I think one of the theorists that the author of that article uses, and I bring this up because every time I've read someone like Linda Hutchin, and for those who don't know, is a literary scholar, a feminist scholar who works with parody and satire and things like that, and architecture, and even this other literary theorist who's quoted in the article,
Wolfgang Iser or Iser.
Yeah.
I sort of knew that name. I now think I had to go read it, but read his work. I don't think I've ever read it.
I know I need to go, because a lot of people, and I had talked to in one of our researching Tolkien things about reading Tolkien from a process theological perspective. And Tripp's podcast is literally all about process theology, and it's process theological evangelism and then Tolkien evangelism and things like that, And so, but part of it is this, which Iser's theory had talked about. One of the quotes in the Harry Potter thing talked about the meaning of a text being in between the text and the reader. Right. And so it's this in between, right? It's not locked in with the text. It's not locked in with the reader. And obviously, as it travels through time and interacts with communities in the world, even those momentary, minuscule in between the text and the reader in those moments is not the same. And so very much in process theological spaces, it's the same way that we conceive of God, reality, our relationship, where it's in between. It's this constant motion where even God changes, God's self, in relation to the world, and as the world evolves and the universe changes. And so I think that a lot of people here are open to that religiously, but when it comes to fandom and reading, I think this is the same for literary people too, that like bridging that gap and bringing like literary conceptions that are applicable to like their religious beliefs or philosophical beliefs, and then vice versa, is it can be hard to bridge that gap. And so I think that the work that and I say that just because the work that you're doing, I think is emblematic of just that work of just letting people figure out those in between spaces and comfortable in those spaces. Yeah. Yeah. So I guess too, based on all those things that you've been reading, tell us a little bit about maybe like your current perspectives, discoveries, insights into Tolkien in relationship to your current work on atheist, agnostic, and animist perspectives. You gave us a little bit with your surveys, but if you have any more, unpack it for us. We would love it.
Yeah. Well, I almost feel like I'm false pretenses. At the moment, I'm not working too actively on this project. It's been something I've been doing since 2018, and of course, COVID kind of affected everything. In fact, it was great to put together the handout for this because it got me back thinking about it. We've been working on the proposal that we've got submitted, cross fingers for the Queer Tolkien anthology, and then the race and racisms one, because those are under contract. So it's I would tell my friends and students, when you're an academic, the real deadlines are when you have a contract that says it. Before that, it's sort of, whenever. But I certainly remember I presented at a couple of face-to-face and at least one online virtual conference. And in those presentations, I tried to take little chunks from my data, because the method I'm using, which is this open-ended question, people can write anything from 1 word to 5,000 words or more in answer to a question. Analyzing this is a longer process than, well, maybe not. I've never done statistical stuff, but being able to generate the statistical stuff, you have to keep rereading and develop categories and work from it. And it's a very small group of responses, 112. And so I tried a little bit of comparison, like were there things that atheist readers who said they were atheists, noticed that the animists or agnostics didn't? And no, I don't think so. So I'll be working with some other ways. And it was when I pulled together all the queer respondents to the survey, which was about 30% of my total respondents, much higher than general population, that I really realized I needed to do a book on it. So that's what I'll be doing once I get the anthologies moved through. But as I work through the data analysis, and I'll go back and do more of it because it always does become more complicated. I mentioned all the different definitions of atheists and agnostics and what people did or did not believe in. And actually, some people would define themselves as 2 or more of the categories. So that was really fascinating. And the real amazing stuff is in the written answers. A lot of people tell stories in their answers, and it becomes very amazing to read those stories. I'm hoping with whoever I work with for the book, I can get at some point just all of this stuff published, so people can see all of it, not just my analysis. And the biggest insight I came out of, reading this, writing this up, presenting it, and then talking to people after I presented, a number of whom were ministers who were fascinated. They came up to talk to me about it, is that these stories are powerful, fascinating ones. And if people are somehow thinking that the atheists, agnostics, animists, will have totally different ideas about Tolkien than Christian readers, it's like, well, yes, there are some differences. But really, I think, and I say this on the handout where I give some samples of responses, if people didn't know those were from an atheist or agnostic or animist reader, I don't know that this would tell them, except, in the very few cases where somebody mentions it in their answer. So I really would like to see more work done in this area across all the spectra of religious beliefs, just to see what do we share in terms of thinking about Tolkien, and also where are some of the areas of difference that we could explore, not in a conflicting, sort of debate-oriented right and wrong kind of thing, but just to understand more about human beings, so that they simply, so that we simply can see more of that the complexities within Tolkien. Actually, I have a bit of a gripe with some academic scholars, even the ones who don't sort of promote a sort of allegorical religious readings. These are people even who are in the postmodern camp. They still, for whatever reason, and I mean, I got my PhD and I got trained in all this, and I think PhD people get trained to think they're authorities in ways. They are still presenting in a very authoritative way that to me, some of them seem to shut down any chance of other interpretations, to sort of say, this is it, this is Tolkien. And that, of course, is one way to do scholarship, but I think that's, whatever conclusion you're drawing is not the best way, because one of the categories for all the responses that I was seeing that is my favorite is, it depends on the definition, it's complicated. And so in terms of the responses fall into when they're answering the questions that I give. And I think that's, if I maybe had to do a subtitle for the book, it would be, it depends on the definition and it's complicated. That I really like reading. I like reading all of the stuff, but I really enjoy the people who are willing to push on how complicated and contradictory their own feelings may be about Tolkien, because I think that reflects his complicated, contradictory feelings.
Yeah, for sure. And when I read the handout, I had seen those responses you were talking about. And like you said, if I had not known beforehand that those were responses from atheists, they sound very similar to a lot of Christian bloggers and even academics who, love Tolkien's virtues and sacrificial values, heroism that is in there. And, and even the complexity, I think language, why some of this work is important, that even religiously, like myself, I'm a Buddhist Christian, so I identify as both. And I think that a lot of people had either participated but didn't have the language or weren't allowed to use that language because it was unsafe in whatever space they were in. But now language is becoming, this language is becoming more easily available. It's becoming probably promoted more in spaces and, like I said, more available. And so people are becoming more comfortable saying, like you were talking about with even atheists and agnostics kind of having more than one identifier as people with religious, identification as well. And there's something in particular about fans that I cannot remember what you said that was important because I was going to follow up on it. I guess no, because you had brought it up. I guess just more of a transition, those perspectives. So with your current work, and then of course me and you have talked about, and I think that our perspective on collaboration with progressives who are like-minded in the work we do and things that we want to accomplish and even just enjoy each other's company and have fun together, as opposed to, I don't want to hang out with Christian assholes, you don't want to hang out with atheist assholes, that sort of thing. Like, how important is it to kind of bring in this collaboration of people who aren't more, I guess, just, even if that collaboration has happened between us, it's, what's happening. We've got people like, this was what I was going to bring up, because we've got people like our friend Tom Emanuel, who's been on the podcast too, who's doing work and talking about kind of post-religious engagement with Tolkien. And even we had John Garth on, and he is somebody I don't think who is a believer, quote unquote, using that term. I think those were his words. But he still kind of found the Lord of the Rings to serve as this moral value text to inform his practical daily life. And so, and even our future project for here, we're trying to do like, what does it look like to actually participate in Tolkien fandom in a way that's maybe more religious? Maybe we'll give a Tolkien inspired sermon, that sort of thing. And so I see those things as a product of the engagements of the scholarship you're doing, our interactions, fandoms getting together. So do you see those like engagements as important as, with atheists, agnostics, animists coming together, maybe with Christians, Buddhists, Muslims, etc.?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. I mean, there are all sorts of spaces where it might happen. It's not only limited to fandom. I think actually people already are. Although I think when we talk about Tolkien fandom, it gets awfully misleading because the internet has decentralized everything and so many different spaces. I mean, I'm not sure I call myself active in fandom anymore, even though I am definitely a fan. My main fandom activity was on LiveJournal between like 2003 and 2010. And all sorts of, LiveJournal got sold to the Russian corporation and stuff happened and all sorts of stuff. So I'm not actually participating actively in those fan spaces. But yet I know I talk to people, there are Tumblr spaces for Tolkien fandom, Facebook spaces, Twitter, Discord, which I've only fairly recently learned about. And I know Reddit apparently has. So, but there actually are, and there isn't one Tolkien fandom. There are many, many, many iterations of different, and it can vary widely across the platforms. So I suspect, when I say my Tolkien fandom, it's only that bit of fandom I knew about. But that was, although predominantly women, and not all cis women, but predominantly women, cis and trans women, and probably a little queerer than the general population, with some ethnic diversity, although there's more and more awareness of racism within even queer spaces of fandom online, and certainly religious beliefs, although again, the dominance of Christian believers. I mean, there were, conflicts because certain big story festivals were tied to the Christian holidays or certain events, and people who are Jewish couldn't do it because of their beliefs and practices. But people would talk about it and would try and do things. And the more decentralized nature of online fandom means it's possible. I mean, it's not like, there was a whole online fandom in the 90s, alt-rec stuff and mailing lists, and apparently those were centralized in a way that you just didn't have that many options. LiveJournal is usually what is credited with decentralizing it. For example, I was a large fan and wrote Frodo Faramir fan fiction, and it was called Interspecies. Although they didn't use interspecies for Legolas, Aragorn, man-elf fandom. They used it for Hobbit man fandom, and it actually, again, this was 2003, 4, 5, 6. It actually was controversial because there were some people among the fandom even then who saw a hobbit and a man having sex as pedophilia, because hobbits are the size of children. And I was going, Frodo is 50 years old. He is older than Faramir. And that led to some debate and other stuff. But so the interspecies group founded their own LiveJournal community where those of us who wanted and enjoyed reading it could do it. People who didn't want to do it didn't. I mean, that issue of pedophilia and fiction, it's gotten even more complicated on, Tumblr and the Archive of Our Own, and like that got complicated with the Harry Potter fandom. I admit I stayed far away from anything that was a student teacher fic.
Yeah,
I was active in the fandom, but I mean, you just couldn't help seeing some stuff. And as a teacher, I was going, nope. So yes, I don't know how I got started on this, but I warned you I can go anywhere with them.
I love it.
Within fandom spaces, that is already happening. I would like to see more of it in the sort of conference and academic spaces, or at least scholarly spaces. And I think the more virtual events we do, the better. I'm involved in the Pop Culture Association, and they're going back to face-to-face conferences. And during the two virtual conferences we had, I forget how many, 18 or 19 people presenting. For the first year back face-to-face in San Antonio, I got 5 proposals, and one of them was mine. Hopefully that'll change when we're not in Texas, but it's clear that the face-to-face mode is very much functions to exclude many people because of the barriers, accessibility, economics. At least for a few years, I had friends in Canada and the UK who wouldn't even try to come to the US because of Trump's border policies.
Right.
So yes, the virtual events, I think, are really would open up much more possibility for much more dialogue and cooperation and collaboration and learning about what people are doing. I don't expect, in terms of my feminist work, I don't expect people to go out and, take a feminist class so that they can listen to what I say or read what I say. Hopefully they can, if they're interested, they can pick up stuff afterwards. The same would be true for this, and I'm not a scholar of religion, and I actually don't read stuff that I think is called theology. I haven't read very much of a lot of the stuff that's out there that is on in terms of this Christian approaches to Tolkien. And as I say in that response I did to the one writer, to Don Williams, I have no problem with a really good, interesting explication of religious imagery in Tolkien. I learned a lot by reading because I don't know that much about Catholic imagery and saints. And I have no problem with someone presenting their interpretation of that. Where my problems are with this is the only correct reading.
Yeah.
This is the intention of Tolkien. I'm pet peeve is authorial intentionality. And I saw far too much of it from my students in Texas. And I don't blame them, because I think that's how they were taught in high schools. Or the idea that this somehow is a conversion tool that was expressed by Ralph. I get very paranoid about, it doesn't matter what sort of doing, the idea of trying to convert people to anything. But I'm also fairly optimistic, because as a teacher of some 3+ decades, I used to meet the responses where people were talking about how all the teachers were brainwashing students into liberal, whatever. And this was happening in the 90s.
Yeah.
This is not new. My response was, I can't get all of my students to turn their papers in stapled in a manila folder for my ease of grading. Until I can do that, I don't have time to convert them.
Right. Seriously.
Feminist, godless communism, Marxism, whatever. People just don't give students enough credit for resisting following instructions or even ideologies. Sorry, but yeah.
No, as an aspiring teacher, that's real. If you can get kids to even care about it first, that's your first obstacle before, you start indoctrinating children, what you said, I think was just a lot of it was just, it resonated with my experience. And I think I feel like people that I know who will be a part of this, and hopefully some people who haven't come and will come and hear this talk and interview and hear your experience, some of that will resonate too. I have to interject too. You're talking about Faramir and Frodo and that whole fanfic controversy, but all I can think about, and I have to get it out, is that I think about like the old badges of Frodo lives, and all I can think about now is Frodo fucks. Like that, he can knock his boots if he wants to. He is a 50-year-old man. So that is great.
Well, and that in itself is interesting. The fact that a lot of critique of Tolkien is there's no sex.
Right.
In Tolkien, which technically, depending on how you define it, is true. But also, I remember about the Peter Jackson movie, there were all these people saying, well, women won't like this movie. It's just all these men. And I'm sitting out here going, have you looked at all these men? Because the fandom exploded. with the movie and with a whole lot of sexy fics, mostly because of the interest in slash fiction, male.
Right.
So yeah, and I think that's why people were sort of freaked out, do sort of freak out about it. So it's there's just so much there to think about and look at and to talk about.
Yeah.
And it's so much fun.
Before we get off here, can you tell people how they can get connected to your work, or where they can find you, or things that you want to get them connected to?
I actually just created a Substack. When I left Facebook, I decided I'd be putting a bunch of my Tolkien stuff online, and I'm trying out Substack. So it's called Writing, Writing from Ithilien. Ithilien's my favorite place in all of Middle-earth. And the handout I prepared, actually the last few pages are bibliographic. I have a bunch of the scholarship on religions and Tolkien, scholarship on reception study, including databases with Bill Fleece's Marquette's The Oral History, where he interviewed lots and lots of people and has those transcribed, and the Hobbit Project and Lord of the Rings Project by Martin Barker, and some other stuff. And at the very end of that, I do post a number of my bibliographic and sort of reception publications, most of which, not all, but most of which are online, because more and more I'm wanting to publish my scholarship in open access. So especially anything on fandom, I want it available to fandom to read. There's lists of things on the handout. And I have my email address on that if people want to see about getting in touch and getting something that they can't get. If I have PDFs, I'm happy to share it. So.
Yeah, and just connecting with Robin, if you decide to do so, as somebody who kind of took a chance and went on Tolkienist and sent you an email, Robin is probably the most welcoming person I've met in Tolkien fandom. I mean, I had ideas, and she was like, "Here, do you want a platform to tell us about your ideas?" And so Robin's just that kind of person. So I would encourage you to go connect with her and even read her work. When her books come out, buy her books. Give her some steady income. Read the fan. Get connected to the Silmarillion Writers Guild, all that good stuff. But Robin, thanks for doing this.
Thank you.
Yeah, good to have you. I hope people get connected to your work, and if anything else, I get an excuse to hang out with you for an hour. So it's been super fun.
Fun. Thank you.